Thank you for having me here. It's really wonderful to come down to Salerno and speak with you all. So yeah, I'm Hugh. Today I'm going to be talking about digital sovereignty and the battle for AI standards. It's going to be quite a hard presentation to give because on the one hand there are a lot of experts on digital sovereignty in here, and on the other hand I suspect some of you are quite new to the topic, so I'll try and include a bit of everything, and we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to split the talk. Okay, perfect. Got that in the end. So I'm going to split the talk into three key areas. So the first is to give a bit of an overview of how I understand the debates on digital sovereignty as taking place, how they've evolved. So hopefully for those of you who aren't that familiar with the topic, this will give you a bit of an introduction as to how to understand the concept. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why I think what some of the issues in the current debate and where the current debate are going, particularly that a lot of it focuses on power and control without taking into consideration a lot of the questions surrounding legitimacy. So in essence, to put forward a normative theory of what digital sovereignty could be understood as. And finally, I'm going to talk through a case study of AI standards. So on paper, when you hear the word standards, incredibly boring topic. But hopefully, I'm going to convince you all that despite being boring, it's incredibly important for the future of how AI is governed in both Europe and beyond. Okay, so debates over digital sovereignty. What is digital sovereignty? So I asked ChatGPT to give me a word cloud of digital sovereignty in related terms, and as you'll see here, there's a number of terms which sort of seem similar, like cyber sovereignty, technological sovereignty, internet governance, etc., etc. So how I understand digital sovereignty is an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of kind of subsidiary terms like cyber sovereignty, which basically refers to efforts to control the digital or assert authority over the digital and digital technologies. But if we look at how debates about digital sovereignty have evolved, I see there as being really two key categories. So the first is what I call narrow but deep conceptions of digital sovereignty. This is conceptions which are really aligned with traditional concepts of sovereignty. And the second is broad but shallow. So these are concepts that take a bit away from this tradition of sovereignty on the one hand, but on the other try and include a broader range of stakeholders. So don't worry, I'm going to talk through both now before you get concerned about not really understanding. So the first is deep but narrow conceptions. So as Mara was introducing earlier, a lot of the focus has been on state sovereignty or state digital sovereignty. And this is for a lot of reasons. So with the onset of internet and global connectivity, the ability of the state to control things like the internet has been challenged. You know, if I am Lithuania, what can I do to stop crazy people saying stuff on Twitter? You know, it's a lot more difficult than a crazy person saying something in the corner of the square in the centre of the city. So in response to this, deep but narrow conceptions focus on efforts to re-establish state control over digital technologies. And part of this is the internet. So some of this debate has included things like cybersecurity and cyber attacks. So to try and introduce an idea of sovereignty to the internet. I'd say those conversations haven't gone very far for obvious reasons because it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. The second is to try and create digital borders. So China is the clear example of this. You've got this thing called the Great Firewall, which is when you go into China, if you don't have a VPN, you won't be able to access Twitter, Facebook, etc., etc. So they've tried to control what information the population can have and in a certain way assert digital sovereignty over their territory. And the third is strategic autonomy, and this is the type of thing we're seeing in the European Union, which is a view that there's an over-reliance on American technologies, and because of this, trying to develop indigenous European capacities so that if there's a Trump presidency, you're not entirely reliant on what the US might do. But this state-centric model has quite a number of problems. If we think about how the world has changed over the past 75 years, we're not just talking about states as important players. You've got non-state actors conducting cyber attacks that lead to deaths in hospitals. You've got non-state actors like big tech companies controlling we'll talk about contact tracing apps actually soon, and how contact tracing apps should be governed. So these companies came to the French government, the European governments, and said, no, you can't centralise this data we're collecting. We will decide the rules for contact tracing apps. So companies asserting dominance in a way that we haven't seen previously. And yeah, the development of nuclear weapons means that the way states used to control, the way they used to assert power was through taking more territory. But if someone has a nuclear weapon, you're far less likely to do that. And this aligns with markets becoming more important and wealth becoming more important in certain ways than traditional weapons. So this is deep and narrow. So in response to the limitations of the state and the limitations of just applying digital sovereignty to the state, a lot of scholars have come out and said, okay, we need what I'm going to call broad but shallow. So this is broad in the sense that they're trying to encompass a lot more stakeholders in the discussion about digital sovereignty than you usually have in a really state-centric approach. So here we're talking about private companies, we're talking about indigenous groups, we're talking about citizen groups. Different scholars have argued in different ways that these actors should be seen as holding some degree of digital sovereignty. And this is intuitive, right? This feels right. If we're talking about the control of digital technologies, it's not just the state doing this anymore. There's various influences and there's various ways that control and authority is asserted over these technologies. The problem with this is, when you had a state-centric model, it was pretty clear, who could be considered a sovereign actor. But now we're starting to include other actors. It's unclear who we should see as a legitimate digital sovereign. Should we consider citizen groups? Should we consider private companies? Should we consider indigenous groups? There's no consensus in the literature as to which way, how we should determine this. So there's a lot of efforts going on at the moment to try and solidify this concept of digital sovereignty. And this is where I'm trying to push the theoretical discussion forward a little bit by talking about the problem with descriptive approaches. So a lot of analyses which have tried to include companies in the discussion, for instance, have said, okay, Google has more power here. Google has more control over these technologies, so therefore they should be considered some sort of sovereign actor. But to me, this isn't accurate or sufficient, because sovereignty is about not just control, not just power, but also legitimacy. It's about authority over technologies rather than just control. So what I'm going to try and talk about in the next section is, with states, you've got a traditional social contract that gives them legitimacy. You have this unspoken agreement with the Italian government that they can do X because it's assumed it's in your interest. We don't have that with Google. So we need to start thinking about what legitimate means in the context of digital sovereignty. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a normative approach that I've been trying to develop. So when you talk about sovereignty, traditionally, it's in itself very contested, but it comes down to three key things. So a sovereign is supreme, a sovereign has authority, and a sovereign wields this authority within a territory. Now, when it comes to the digital, all three of these are problematized. So I'm going to try and talk about how normative digital sovereignty adapts these features to try and develop the concept of digital sovereignty that is useful for when we're talking about the types of competition that's happening between citizen groups, big tech companies, and states. So the first concept is probably the most difficult. Authority is one of the most contested concepts in political philosophy. So to try and talk about authority in the context of big tech companies is incredibly tricky thing to do. But as a starting point, authority means legitimate control. It means that control over technology isn't coercive. What legitimacy means is more contested, but here I'm going to say it is the moral acceptance via public consent of control of a technology or of a rule developed in relation to a technology. And this legitimacy can come from different places, but usually it comes from either input or output. So input here could be something like a democratic process. It could be a tech company or a government asking citizens what they think about a technology. It could also come through transparency and accountability processes. So it's clear to everyone what's going on, and if people don't like it, then they can push back against it. So these types of input legitimacy mechanisms are common in everyday democracy. Output or effectiveness of a rule is another way of getting legitimacy. So if you look at social contracts in non-democratic states, for instance, somewhere like China, somewhere like the United Arab Emirates, the legitimacy of these governments isn't based on democratic voting. It's based on them giving stuff to citizens which is seen as equal or if not more important than having a vote. And this kind of output is perhaps where tech companies will rely on. You know, we all love our phones, we all love playing on apps, and if tech companies don't have that sort of legitimacy, then they don't have so the key thing is there's not one source of legitimacy that can be applied in every context. Legitimacy is a competing claim here. It is, in some contexts, control over this technology would be suitable because input is appropriate. But in another context, democratic procedures, for instance, won't be useful. So I'm quite skeptical about what a lot of these tech companies like OpenAI or Anthropic are doing when it comes to direct democracy. They're asking a lot of citizens what they think about these technologies, but that doesn't feel appropriate, right? I'd want to see democratic oversight through the state. So, in short, there's no silver bullet for what legitimacy means. It's more a dialogue between different actors. So the second aspect is territoriality. Traditionally, you have a state and it asserts authority over that territory. But clearly when we talk about digital technologies, that doesn't really fit, right? If we talk about the internet, how can you talk about territoriality? So when we think about digital technology and framing these debates, these battles that are going on to assert authority over technologies, I think it's far more productive to talk about a stack of digital technologies that underpin everything we do in kind of computation. So this is again me asking ChatGPT to create a graphic, and as you'll see, a lot of the words aren't real words or a typo ridden, but you should get an idea from this that, at a high level, you've got things like the natural resources that go into building computers, building your iPhone. Then you've got things like the chips, semiconductors. Then you've got things as you keep going down, the AI systems, you've got the applications they're built on. And I think at each one of these layers, we can talk about the types of battles that are taking place for digital sovereignty. And finally, there's the concept of supremacy, which has been held when we talk about sovereign actors, the sovereign state. This has always been a myth, right? The state has never held supreme authority over everything. There's been the church, there's the UN, there's the EU. Well, there was the EU for me, but there is the EU for you now. And these are all competing centres. So to say the state was supreme is a bit of a myth. But I think digital technologies have really shown just how much of a myth this is, particularly for small states, If you are the European Commission, if you are the US government, you've got a lot of authority to say to tech companies, we don't want you to do this. But if you're Equatorial Guinea, you're probably going to struggle to tell X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it now, to take down harmful content if they don't want to. So from this, I'd say that states should be understood as a primus inter pares. They're still really central players, but they're not the only players that matter for digital sovereignty. So yeah, to try and summarize that in a really clear takeaway paragraph that for those of you who don't have a strong background in digital sovereignty can understand, normative digital sovereignty for me is an umbrella term encompassing competition and cooperation that takes place to assert control over this stack of digital technologies. If an actor isn't trying to be legitimate, if it's not seeking some sort of input or output legitimacy, it can't be considered a sovereign. And I think this is where I have a lot of problems with some of the literature on digital sovereignty at the moment, because it frames companies like Google or like Meta that may not be even trying to be legitimate as being legitimate sovereigns. So, I'm going to change it up now and talk about a case study, just to try and put what I've talked about in this high-level theory into practice, and B, give you some insights into what in theory is a boring topic, but in practice is really important. And you may be wondering why I'm using a shipping container here as to visualize AI standards, right? Shipping containers are an incredibly old technology. But it was standardization that facilitated globalization. Prior to a bunch of people coming together and saying, we should have shipping containers fitting these dimensions, it was chaos. It was expensive to ship goods. You couldn't stack things neatly on shipping containers. So the world was a more disconnected place. But through stakeholders coming together and agreeing on a set of standards, globalization was facilitated. So I would posit that it was this that leads to all the nice things we have now. Perhaps an exaggeration. So, what are technical standards? I think something in my eye. So, when we think about the governance of AI technologies in particular, I would say we can think about it at really 4 levels of abstraction. At the highest level, you've got principles. So there's been a lot of work over the past 7, 8 years internationally to try and reach agreement on what principles should govern AI technologies. And we've been really successful at this. Most countries around the world, well, technically all if you look at UNESCO principles, have come and said, okay, we agree AI should be these 8 things. You know, it should be fair, it should be transparent, you know, it should serve the good of humanity. And this is great until you start trying to think about what these high-level, vague framings mean in different national contexts. What fairness means in China and what fairness means in Italy is hugely different. And that means turning these principles into practice is very difficult. So at the next level, you've got regulation, and that's what really tries to do this at the national or EU level in terms of setting the specific rules about how AI should be governed. So I put the Commission up there in the little circle because the EU has been doing a lot of work to create this thing called the AI Act, which I know some of you are very familiar with, but perhaps others aren't, which establishes rules for how AI should be governed. Okay, that's great. But regulations around the world are completely different when it comes to AI. The UK is saying, we don't need a specific AI regulation. Instead, we're going to leave each regulator to create their own rules. So imagine I'm a small tech company, and I want to sell my product in both the UK and the EU. That's going to be a mess, right? That is incredibly difficult. And this is where these boring things called standards come in, right? They're acting as the shipping containers for AI. They are harmonizing different national approaches. They're explicating how rules should be made. So the EU has turned to the EU's standards body and said, okay, tell me what in practice a risk assessment for an AI system looks like. So they're super important. And then this bottom level is specification. So the distinction here between a standard and a specification is quite narrow, but it's worth putting in the sense that a standard will point towards a specific technical measure, which is a specification. So something like a benchmark that will say if your system is, you know, safe or fair. Different testing mechanisms that you won't have at a standards level. And the important thing about specifications is there's lots of them coming out of industry groups, coming out of academia. So the ecosystem is a bit of a mess. So what standards are trying to do is point to what good looks like at a lower level and connect that to regulation at a higher level. Okay, I hope you're all with me still, and that everything is understood. So if we think back to the digital sovereignty framework I put out, there are kind of two elements. So the first was control, and the second was legitimacy. So regarding the battle for control over these standards, I went in thinking it would be quite straightforward. It would be the US would be disagreeing with China, etc., etc. But the reality I found through speaking to standards makers all over the world, standards experts all over the world, is that everything is very messy. But I'm going to try and break it down into 3 levels to talk about how competition to control these standards is taking place. So at the first level, you haven't got a single institution that is saying we are responsible for making these standards for AI. You've got ISO and IEC, which are 2 standards bodies that have come together to say we're going to try and make rules for AI. You've got IEEE, which is a separate standards body, who are saying we're also going to try and make rules for AI. And you've got the ITU, which are doing the same thing. So again, imagine that I'm a small tech company. Whose standards do I follow? That's pretty hard. So at the moment, there's a lot of uncertainty as to whose standards should be followed and why. So these institutions are in various ways competing to assert control. The second, as if that wasn't complicated enough, is between international and regional bodies. So ISO and IEC is an international organization that is creating standards for AI. These standards are put forward by industry, and at the end of the day, industry will probably adopt them. So this is a very bottom-up approach to standards making. CEN-CENELEC is the European standards body. So this institution was told by the European Commission, okay, you guys need to make technical standards that can give more detail to the AI regulation that we've created. Okay? Theoretically, there are international treaties that say mutual recognition between these standards should be in place so that we don't have multiple different standards between regions. In practice, that's not really how it's working. So the optimists, the person who was chairing this committee at CEN-CENELEC, said to me he thinks around 1/3 will be European-specific standards and around 2/3 will be those coming from international standards bodies in some way. They might be adapted a little bit, but they'll largely be the same. I was speaking to a big tech company, an unnamed big tech company, who said they would be thrilled if it was just 1/3 that was indigenously created in the EU, and that they're preparing for 100% difference between international and European level standards. So the political dynamics there are also very interesting. And the third is the battles within these institutions. And this is perhaps the juiciest, right? Because this is what's happening between different companies, different individuals in making these standards. So you've got some classic dichotomies that you would expect when thinking about, who wants to shape the rules that will govern AI. You've got big tech companies saying, we don't need much regulation. Let's have some really, light guiding rules that will tell us how we should do our processes to be compliant with EU regulation. You've got civil society who don't have to follow any of these standards, so are saying, you guys should do everything under the sun, You guys need to do X, Y, and Z, and then you can be seen as complying with the law. So I was like, okay, that's quite straightforward. But then you've got a lot of different levels that happen at the kind of personal political level. So you've got horizontal companies like big tech companies who will be covered by every different sector, their products cover everything. But then you've got what's called, a vertical organization. So say I'm a healthcare AI tech company. I only have interest in this very narrow aspect. So they're disagreeing with big tech companies because these interests aren't aligned. You've got what I'm calling here a transient coalition. So again, speaking to people a couple of days ago in Brussels, I'm going to say an unnamed big tech company was aligning quite clearly with the European Commission's position. They were speculating why, but on account of this being recorded, I'll save that for the coffee break. And finally, there's vested interest in politics. So when you look at institutions, I think it's so easy to forget that there's people behind this. So there's a lot of people who are taking part in both ISO IEC and CEN-CENELEX processes. So if I create a standard in one, I also want that to be the standard in the other, because if it's not, I've wasted a lot of time. So you've got a lot of people who just don't really fit into the neat categories that are present. So, long story short, interesting space, a lot of thinking still needs to be done. So then I'm going to talk about some of the normative considerations. And given that there are so many different battles taking place, it's hard to just pick one angle for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk briefly about the legitimacy of the types of standards that are being created here as rules. You know, should we consider them good? Should we consider them ethical? And these are some quotations from interviews I've been conducting with standards makers about the input legitimacy and the output legitimacy of the types of rules that are being created. So on the positive side, the first person there, they were saying that standards making for AI is the most diverse standards making process they've been involved in. Right? This is good. You know, you want civil society organizations. You want tech companies who have that interest. You want, I don't know, governments in some way. So these different interest groups coming together is a great thing for making good rules, in theory. But the practice is the second quotation, and I think that's what perhaps one of the key takeaways should be. So to read it out. The strongest asymmetry is between those spending 80 hours a week in standardization, who are getting paid massive amounts by big tech to support this, and experts who are representing civil society and struggle to put 5 hours a week in to attend meetings. So you've got big tech behind it. Although a lot of different organizations are coming in, you've got a lot more time and energy and money being put in by big tech companies to create this rule, which creates a really key input legitimacy question, right? It's not this idea that the European Commission had when it gave creating the rules to CEN-CENELEX. It's not what the British government hopes when it says, okay, let's use ISO standards to guide some of the work we're doing. So output legitimacy might be more promising. And I think output legitimacy is more complicated because on the one hand, you've got, you know, rules shaped just by big tech companies leads to bad rules. But on the other hand, because there's a lot of institutional competition taking place, it means that the rules that are created don't necessarily have to be adopted if they're created by ISO. So, to give you a different quotation here, I'm not naming a big tech company, thankfully. So, ex-big tech company pushed a little too far in watering down an ISO standard to the point where the Commission considered it unacceptable for Europe. So I guess when I was talking here earlier about this competition between the international standards bodies and the European standards bodies, this tension between how much the European Union can adopt from international standards bodies can at least in part be blamed to big tech companies pushing it a little too far to start with. Okay, so I've talked a lot and I'd rather have a bit of a discussion with everyone. So I'm just going to say my thanks for listening thus far. This is an image from a project called Better Images of AI, if no one's ever seen that. So that's meant to be an image recognition AI system, rather than a kind of killer robot image you'd often see if you just Google AI. So yeah, thank you everyone, and looking forward to